As I thought about my topic for today, I was asked to present a chapter from the book, The Gospel for Disordered Lives. And I thought, you know what, go big or go home. I'm just going to jump in. We're going to talk about trauma and abuse. All right, so these are topics that come up often. I consistently hear from my counseling students that this is an area of interest, and yet it's one that is somewhat underdeveloped in the field of biblical counseling. There's been a lot done in the last few years to bridge the gap between secular literature and biblical or Christian counseling trauma research. But I think about the issues that people are going to face in our churches and realize that trauma is probably one of the most prevalent. That all of us will either experience some sort of traumatic event for ourselves, or we will walk alongside of somebody who has experienced a traumatic event. And so my aim here, a little bit different from some of these other papers, I want to help equip you so that you are just an ounce more prepared to deal with this when you come across this in your ministry. Trauma, a definition of trauma can be broken down into three components. The first is that there's some sort of abnormal experience that happens. All right, trauma doesn't just happen in a vacuum, but there's some sort of abnormal experience or what we might call a precipitating event. All right, that might be something like a car accident. It might be something like witnessing a crime. It might be being in combat. It might be experiencing a sexual assault or a myriad of other events that are atypical to everyday life. The second component, the person experiencing this precipitating event has a normal reaction. Okay, abnormal event, normal reaction. Remember those are important. Finally, the third component that's very important is that the precipitating event overwhelms that person's ability to cope. Okay, so this precipitating event, normal response, but then there's this sense of being overwhelmed. In other words, the event so impacts the person that they experience significant difficulty returning to a normal state of being or functioning as a means of coping with or avoiding potential harm. Each of these responses, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, are normal responses to abnormal events. And yet, in most cases, they are automatic. They happen without choosing them. It's also worth noting here before we move forward that quite often with abuse, there's a level of secrecy that hides what's happening. The secrecy is used by the abuser to continue inflicting trauma on the victim. So while secrecy by virtue of what it is may be a hidden manifestation, it is still very common. That might be overt as well. For instance, messages like, if someone finds out, you'll be the one in trouble, or no one's going to believe you, or this is your fault. But I can't help but think about the words of Proverbs 10:11 as it relates to this. There, the writer of Proverbs says, the mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but the mountain of the wicked conceals violence. The abuser's words are not life-giving. They hide violence and are life-taking. This certainly isn't the only instance of trauma. In the scriptures, we see a multitude of examples: murders, rapes, wars, genocide, slavery, and others fill the pages. Not to mention the crucifixion of Jesus. Traumatic events are pervasive in Scripture. And the reason for this is because of the depth and pervasiveness of sin. One brother murders another brother, Genesis 4, right? And we see all the way through, trauma continues. In each of the instances on the pages of Scripture, traumatic events happen because one person desires something that they should not desire and mistreats another to fulfill that desire. But the Bible clearly teaches that those instances should not be so. Remember the definition of trauma we worked through earlier. It's a normal reaction to an abnormal event that overwhelms one's ability to cope. It's not the response that is abnormal. It's the precipitating event that's outside of common experience. And though we experience the effects of sin every moment of every day, the traumatic event is even more uncommon than this. We also noted earlier, and it was shown here in this passage, that abuse is about power and control. More specifically, an abuser assumes improper power and control over another human being at their direct expense. Put another way, the experience of abuse is an experience of the impact of sin of another person directed towards oneself. But there's another way the scriptures speak to trauma and abuse. They tell us about the ultimate hope, which is the gospel. Part of the message of the gospel is that one day all things will be made new. My mind immediately goes to Revelation 21:4, right, where it says he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Grief, crying, and pain will be no more because the previous things have passed away. There will be no more trauma, no more abuse. First, let me say two initial comments, and I'll walk into some steps for us. First, because of the potential complexity of trauma, particularly repetitive childhood abuse, wise counseling requires both wisdom and competency. Helping people who have suffered complex trauma or recurrent abuse, and sometimes even straightforward instances of trauma or one-time instances of abuse, involves more than what I would call entry-level skill. Poorly done counseling, especially in this area, can do great harm. A helper should be properly equipped to handle such cases, and this might require more training or consultation with more experienced counselors who understand the complexity of sin and suffering. In some cases, we might also consult with outside professionals. Second, because of the nature of trauma and abuse counseling, any helper with a personal history of trauma or abuse should be aware of potential triggers when you work with someone who has been traumatized. Failing to sufficiently work through their own trauma or abuse can impact their ministry to the counselee and may cause more harm than good. So as helpers, I believe we should provide 3 tiers of help. There's 3 main steps, if you will. First, from the very beginning, we should ensure the person is safe and their basic physical needs are met. If the counselee is not safe and lacks essential provision, counseling very well might not be effective. They're still in the midst of their traumatic event. Further, the aim here is to get support for daily living, including the involvement of the church or community resources. The helper should also ask about suicidal thoughts or self-harm and respond accordingly. Second, I do believe that we as helpers should address the trauma and abuse more directly, but in a way that considers the totality of their experience and the effects of the trauma on their life. As counselors, as ministers of the gospel, we would spend a great deal of time hearing their story, compassionately bearing that burden with them, and continually pointing them to the truths in Scripture, especially about God's goodness, his compassion, his sovereignty, his presence, his love, other characteristics that directly relate to someone who's hurting. The helper should grieve the offenses against the counselee where it is appropriate, and it should openly acknowledge sin where it is present in both the offender and the offended. The helper should also work through any heart issues. If there are temptations, desires, spiritual questions, struggles, things that might arise, they're constantly bringing encouragement and biblical truth. An example of that might be Psalm 9:9, which reminds us that the Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. Third, I believe the helper should help the counselee move towards right attitudes and beliefs, though, let me be clear, this should only be done after the first 2 are done. We don't jump to this step from the very beginning. Several temptations exist when trauma or abuse occurs. Maybe a victim mentality, self-righteous anger, bitterness, unforgiveness. Ultimately, these are sinful attitudes, one that go against God's directives for us. Even in the midst of grievous sin, they remain sinful attitudes. And when we see those attitudes and people we aim to help, we should address them. And yet, again, let me be clear, this addressing those sinful attitudes does not undermine our empathy, sitting with them and grieving with them. We balance that out wisely. In doing all of this, the aim is to move towards normalcy and even flourishing, but to do so in a way that is oriented at God and what he has already told us to work towards. Lastly, with great wisdom and patience, a minister or counselor might need to explore forgiveness and reconciliation between the counselee and their offender, but I put that last on purpose. My hope now, at the end of this talk, is not that you're equipped to be a trauma therapist, as I've said, but my hope is that you have a better understanding of what trauma and abuse looks like, that you can recognize it in the life of someone that you're ministering to, and you have some sort of framework for what the Bible teaches and how we ought to respond.